Your work on disasters and hazards in the Philippines has more or less set the bar for the burgeoning field of disaster studies in the country. And just a few years ago, the journal published a double issue on this specific area of research in which you present hazardous of place as a new comparative approach to the Filipino past. What makes hazardousness of place a novel way of analyzing Philippine history, and what insights are generated by this approach that would have otherwise been neglected by traditional frameworks?
Well, let me first of all say, Mike, that of course hazardness of place is not a concept that I coined in any way. It goes back to Ian Burton and Ken Hewitt back in the early 1970s when they used it to signify thinking about not just a disaster, which is the way we tend to think about disasters. We talk about a typhoon or an earthquake, but to look at a place and look at the multiplicity of hazards that people who live there experience. And I think if I remember correctly, they were looking at somewhere in Ontario, I can't remember the town precisely in that early 1970 piece. But what I wanted to say by that, and something that I guess that a lot of my work has revolved around over what is now nearly 30, well, it is 30 years, is that it's to try and think of a more transnational history of the Philippines, where we think about the Philippines in relation to perhaps cultures and societies that we don't usually compare them to. So very soon after getting my PhD and starting to become an active academic, I began to sort of feel myself confined by the fact that I was always talking to other Southeast Asians. So we were, the Philippines is in Southeast Asia. And of course, we have all these arguments about whether it was, Paul's argument about exactly whether it should be or shouldn't be, or part of the Pacific, whatever. But usually it's classified, and you find that most people who do work on the Philippines publish in journals that simply talk about Southeast Asia, and it's comparative. I don't want to do that I don't just want to do that. I think there's a lot of things that about working in Southeast Asia and working in Southeast Asian societies, working in Filipino societies in particular, in my case, where you can share the types of methodologies, the types of thinking, the epistemology basically behind with a wider context. So I've always tried to put, even if I'm writing about the Philippines, I've tried to put my work in journals where it'll be read not just by Southeast Asianists, but by other people working in the similar area. So we can say, hey, look, in many cases, Southeast Asia, in many cases, Philippines is a leader in this. Or this is a really interesting example that has ramifications for a much wider audience. So I've always tried to do that. So what I was trying to say here is, okay, let's just think of not just the Philippines in its national context or even in its sort of a Southeast Asian regional context, but let's look at it in terms of other societies and other cultures that share similar problems. So, the Philippines has earthquakes. The Philippines has everything, just about. And, it's on the Arc of Fire, that stretches across the Pacific in a sort of ring where about 75% of all earthquakes and volcanoes take place. But it's also sort of in that way connected to the sort of alpine Himalayan orogenic belt that stretches all the way from the Atlantic coast in Europe all the way certainly to Java and into, so why not start thinking about the comparison with other societies? So instead of looking, in terms of earthquakes with, say, or typhoons in case of the Philippines and Vietnam or something like that, why don't we think more widely? So I was suggesting there, Iranians and Italians suffer earthquakes in the same way that the Philippines does. Why don't we think about comparisons across, are there similarities? Looking at the track of typhoons, I mean, typhoons that come through the Philippines, if you read the Philippine newspapers, as soon as they get into the South China Sea, they're gone. But of course, they're not. They usually pick up strength again, and then they hurtle into Vietnam, or they hurtle into China, and then they curve round into Korea and Japan. So, there's a sort of, who was it? I think it was the French geographer Gouraud who talked about climatic unity. in the sort of area of the South China Sea and that typhoon belt around there. So again, trying to get people to think more transnationally and to get out of that sort of Southeast Asian regionalism, because I think that there's a lot to say. And I mean, I've now worked in Central Asia, and I'm working around the North Sea as well as in Southeast Asia. And a lot of the concepts, for instance, that are very common in terms of maritime practice, prestige goods, and such like around Southeast Asia, actually apply very nicely around the North Sea basin as well. From the east coast of England to the northwest coasts of Germany and Belgium, France, the west coast of Denmark. And the patterns are very similar. There's, I think, much more interesting sort of exchanges and comparisons that can be done. So what I was trying to say in that piece, in short, was let's start thinking a little bit more widely about and putting Philippine history, Philippine studies in a much wider context.
In relation to that point, in that way, you framed hazardousness of place in terms of the air, the land, and the sea. But how do disease outbreaks or epidemics figure in this whole concept of hazardousness of place?
I mean, that's an interesting one because, and I'm guilty of it very much myself, that disaster studies, in a sense, as a subgenre, has grown in the last 15 or so years, but it tends to be distinct from sort of the history of disease and medicine and epidemics. And while, of course, nobody would deny that COVID-19 and disease itself, epidemics are disasters, there's a sort of, not exactly a silo, but there's a sort of division, and people tend to look at one or the other, rather than thinking about them in a combined way. And I have, because of its medical side, in my own scholarship, I have tended to not focus on epidemics and disease and look at others. And I think COVID-19, if it does anything, really brings us back to this idea that, of course, they're all linked very, very closely together, and it's almost impossible to disassociate them. And I think very interestingly, and again, we can see this not just in the Philippines, but much more widely, is the idea of complex disasters, where you have more than one disaster either happening at the same time or cascading one after another. And of course, I mean, we could look at somewhere, I've already mentioned Ebola in West Africa, and I saw a news report the other night of this man in Conakry saying, my God, we're being ravaged by COVID-19, and now we've got this coming as well, or in Yemen, where the new Biden administration is trying to impose a ceasefire so that people can be vaccinated. Because you have war, and of course, where you have war, you have disease and famine and a whole lot of. So I think perhaps what we'll be focusing on is more this idea of complex emergencies. And in the Philippines in the last year, I think you can see this very clearly in the case of refugees or people who have had to be evacuated because of a disaster, say Typhoon Roli or Goni. The big problem of, you evacuate people to evacuation centers and they become hotbeds of the transmission of COVID-19 because everybody's higgledy on top of one of another, and there's no privacy, and and there's no really very, very difficult to separate people. So clearly, you can start seeing those links, and I think that will become more apparent. So I think there will be a legacy in terms of looking at the way we think about it and actually incorporate, because the virus is with us. Well, I think the virus is with us. That a full stop in one way or another. I mean, as we can see historically, what happens, viruses tend to lose their more deadly, and they just become endemic to the to world society. So I think we've got the virus now for good, or at least for the foreseeable future. So anything we do will have that background to it. In terms of hazardness of place, then I think again the idea here was simply to look at the multiplicity, and this goes back to a lot of the work I've been doing over the last 20 years about looking at what I call cultures of disasters in the Philippines, looking at the hazard as a frequent life experience. Well, this is just another way of looking at it, but instead looking at it on a geographical scale rather than on using culture as the term of the way. So let's look at one place and let's look at all the different kinds of hazards that people have to experience, because they don't experience them one at a time. They're often experiencing them at the same time. And then you have the whole idea of poverty and crime and everything else that's going on, which is another level of analysis. We try, and again, this may be a sort of a consequence of the way Western science has evolved, in the sense that we do divide things into fields to be more specialized in them. And clearly, in a lot of cases, we need to think more holistically about how we deal with things. That's life. That's how people experience things. And it's very, very different from the way often we try to analyze them. The difficulty comes, of course, is that you have to be an expert in all things. And I think that does pose problems for scholarship, or you have to have large teams that are composed of multidisciplinary perspectives that are able to encapsulate that. And that's coming. You can clearly see that. And I mean, in terms of scholarship, most large grants now are team efforts, and they're generally, if you want to be funded anyhow, they generally have to be interdisciplinary team efforts as well, because to try and unpick that, we need multi perspectives to do so.